You are now entering the Free Speech Zone. Here's your host, Eric Barnard.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Free Speech Zone. I am your host, Eric Barnard, coming to you from Atlanta, Georgia on the Constitute Voice network, and we are streaming this podcast on YouTube. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. I'm proud to be joined today by former Georgia Congressman Bob Barr. Congressman, welcome.
Eric, great to see you, as always.
Thanks so much. Again, thanks for doing this. So anyone, if you're not from Georgia, you're unfamiliar with Congressman Barr's work. Congressman Barr has had a very distinctive career in public service. How long have you been in public service now, Congressman? I know you're not currently in elected politics, but you're still serving.
Well, I guess it depends somewhat on the meaning of public service. I really began, I think, my public service in a broad sense back in the early 1970s when I began working for a little company called the CIA.
Oh, wow.
Worked in that capacity for a number of years and then moved down here to Georgia in the late 70s and began practicing law, became very active in the Republican Party, locally, at the state level, nationally, and was honored to serve as the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, appointed by President Reagan. Served in that capacity from 1986 to 1990, took a brief hiatus, and then was elected to serve in the House of Representatives in 1994, and I served in that position for 8 years until early 2003.
Wonderful. So very distinctive. Let's start right there with your time. You were in the CIA in the early 1970s. What did you do at the CIA?
Well, I don't have to kill you, as the old joke goes. Now, if I tell you, I'll kill you.
Don't mean to disappoint anyone out there.
But trained with them for a number of years. They have some very, very comprehensive training programs, and then after I did that, I elected to serve as an analyst. I did current intelligence analysis and writing for a few years, and then toward the end of my law school career, I went to law school at night while I was working for the agency. Then I spent about 4 years or so doing legislative work for them. So basically my time with them was split between training, analysis, and legislative work.
Wow, incredible! So you covered a broad spectrum there at the agency. Were you so if you were there in the 70s, did you happen to serve when the former President George H.W. Bush was the director of the agency? Were you there at that time?
I did. Served under him and became somewhat familiar with him. I wasn't in the top echelon certainly of the agency,
sure,
but doing the legislative work, had the opportunity to interact with him on a number of occasions and discovered that, one, he was a very nice man, very intelligent, and had a great sense of humor, which I enjoyed.
No, that's wonderful, and of course, we lost him. Unfortunately, America lost a great patriot in former President Bush. So you said you went to law school at night. You earned your law degree. You then moved down here to Georgia. You're not originally from Georgia. You actually lived all over the world when you were growing up. You lived in Iran at one point. I've read about. Lived all over the world. So where's home for you, really?
Well, home, of course, is in Smyrna, Georgia, where I've been for many years. I was born initially in Iowa, but never really lived there. My dad was stationed there going to school in the military after he had gotten out of West Point. So from the time I was in 3rd grade until the time I graduated from high school, we lived all over the world. He would move with one company or another to different projects around the world, usually having to do with water. So we lived in Baghdad for a number of years. We lived up in northern Quebec for a few years. We were down in Peru, we were in Panama, Pakistan, and then finally Iran, where I graduated from hye school.
Wow, incredible, incredible. That's an adventurous life, even at a very young age, all the way up to high school. Why did you want to be a lawyer? Why'd you go to law school?
I enjoyed reading about the law and being involved at the agency. I started there before I went to law school. Developed an interest and a lot of friends that were doing legal work for the agency, and decided that rather than go into the career path that I had sort of planned on, which was to work overseas with the agency, I decided to stay stateside, so to speak, go to law school, and then toward the end of my law school career, was 4 years in the evening program at Georgetown, I decided that I'd really wanted to practice litigation, be a trial lawyer. And as a lawyer for the agency, there was no real opportunity to do that.
Sure.
The legal work in which the agency is involved did not involve trials. Those were handled by Department of Justice lawyers. So decided instead to go into the private practice of law. I had friends, fraternity brothers from Georgia, had visited Georgia many times, and decided I wanted to live and practice law in Georgia.
Oh, tremendous. So, and then you came to Georgia, you went into private practice, you said. How did you wind up becoming a prosecutor? You were the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. President Reagan nominated you. How do you go about the job of becoming a United States Attorney?
Well, there's no rule book for it, of course. But through my work in the Republican Party, at the local level and the state level, got to know our senator at the time from Georgia, Mac Mattingly, who was elected to the U.S. Senate here in Georgia as a Republican in the Reagan landslide of 1980. And that was really the election that sort of broke the dam to Georgia, moving from a very tightly controlled one-party state, the Democratic Party, to a two-party state with the Republican ascendancy. And had the opportunity when the U.S. Attorney at the time, back in the mid-1980s, resigned or fulfilled, served as long as he wanted to, Larry Thompson, very, very fine attorney and a good friend, and submitted my name and was fortunate enough to have been selected by Senator Mattingly, who then recommended me to the White House, which then nominated me to the position, and was confirmed by the Judiciary Committee in 1986.
Oh, tremendous. And how long were you in that office?
About 4 years, from 1986 to 1990.
Oh, wonderful. You said you wanted to be a trial lawyer, being U.S. Attorney. That's a great place to actually be involved in trying cases. You took on a whole lot of crimes as U.S. Attorney. You handled one of the things that people came to know you for here in this state was you actually prosecuted a lot of public corruption cases. One of your most prominent cases was the prosecution of former Republican Congressman Pat Swindall. We have a photograph of him here. We're going to put this up here on the screen for anyone who doesn't know what Congressman Swindall looks like. We'll have this up here in just a minute. There he is. How did what did you prosecute Congressman Swindall for?
It was very interesting because this came up again years later during the impeachment of President Clinton, who, as we'll probably get into, and as you certainly know, was impeached for perjury and obstruction of justice. The Pat Swindall case, he was a sitting congressman from the east side of Atlanta at the time, was prosecuted. We prosecuted, our office prosecuted him for perjury and obstruction. It was a money laundering case in which the congressman unfortunately became involved and testified before a federal grand jury. And essentially, if you're before a federal grand jury or a state grand jury, you have basically, like the old game show, you have three doors you can choose from. Door number one is tell the truth. Door number two is to take the Fifth Amendment. Door number three is to lie. Unfortunately for then Congressman Swindall, he chose door number three and was prosecuted and convicted back in, I guess, the final conviction was in, if I recall correctly, early 1989.
Wow. It was a money laundering case. So how in the world does a congressman get involved in money laundering? And don't share too much if you can't. I understand.
So, certainly, money laundering laws and the banking financial regulations are not uncomplex, shall we say. But as a sitting congressman on the Judiciary Committee at the time, Mr. Swindall certainly was familiar with them. The facts of the case surrounded a house, a rather large house that Congressman Swindall was building at the time, and needed to obtain cash to pay the contractor and the subcontractors. Rather than simply go to a financial institution and obtain credit based on a bona fide letter of credit that he had, that the congressman had from the sale of property. He elected to negotiate with an associate of his, who was in fact at the time the target of an undercover operation that the federal government here in my district was running. And the congressman decided to negotiate with that person and to discuss ways, which unfortunately for the congressman we had on tape through the undercover operation, involved taking money and structuring it or paying it in a certain way so that it would be under the reporting requirements. The congressman eventually withdrew from the conspiracy, but unfortunately for him, then he lied about it in the grand jury, and that's what got him in trouble, as often gets people in trouble, particularly in Washington. It's not necessarily the underlying substantive offense, but the cover-up.
Oh, wow. Absolutely tremendous. So that, again, that was your most prominent case. So you left the U.S. Attorney's position after 4 years. You returned to private practice in law. You ultimately decided to seek elective office. Your first run here in Georgia was for the United States Senate. You ran for the Republican nomination. Mac Mattingly, who recommended you to President Reagan for the U.S. Attorney job, was defeated by a man by the name of Wyche Fowler, who was a congressman from Atlanta. And he was up for re-election. This was in 1992, and you ran in the primary, and you ran against another great Georgian, Paul Coverdale. What was that campaign like, running statewide?
It was grueling, certainly. Georgia has, is a large state, geographically the largest.
It's the ninth largest state in the Union,
east of the Mississippi. With 159 counties, so trying to cover all of that on a very, very limited budget that we had was not easy, but we did it. There were 5 men in the race at the time seeking the Republican nomination to run against Wyche Fowler. Paul Coverdale and I were in a runoff in 1992. We were in a runoff, and Paul beat me in the runoff. It was a very close runoff election. Immediately after my defeat to Paul, we held a news conference, and I openly, publicly, and sincerely supported him, which I think he certainly appreciated, and the Republican Party, I think, benefited from to have something which did not, up to that point, happen very often, and that is, after a grueling primary, to have the Republicans come together. But we did. And Paul Coverdale served in the Senate for a number of years, died, of course, far too prematurely, but had a very distinguished career in the Senate.
Yes, he did. That he did. So after that loss, 2 years later, you ran again, not for the Senate. You ran for the House of Representatives, and this was in 1994. This was Speaker Gingrich was leading what would become the Republican Revolution. Why did you opt to run for the House this time? And you ran against a man who, from what I understand, you were now friends with. Your opponent became your friend, a man by the name of Buddy Darden. So I got to ask you a few questions there. Why did you run for the House, and how was the campaign against Congressman Darden?
Back in 1994, which of course was the first off-year election for Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton had been elected in 1992, so 1994 was the first off-year election, so to speak. And largely that election was about him. So basically a referendum, as these things frequently are, on the incumbent. In the middle of an incumbent's first term as president, gives people the opportunity, after having seen that person serve for 2 years, maybe people that hadn't voted for that person decided, hey, this is an opportunity to get back at him. Other people that maybe had voted or had not said, hey, we really like this guy, and now's an opportunity to go ahead and support him. So the 94 election was very much a referendum on Bill Clinton. In Georgia generally, and in what was then the 7th District of Georgia at the time, a very conservative district, had been represented before Buddy Darden by Larry McDonald himself, a very, very conservative Democrat.
Yes.
Buddy, likewise, was generally speaking a moderate, more or less conservative Democrat. Unfortunately for Buddy, what made the difference in the election. Myself, as a novice running against I think he'd been in office 11 or 12 years at the time,
yes.
A very popular incumbent. What made the difference was Buddy Darden cast 2 votes that in particular were very prominent in the '94 election. Mm-hmm. One, he voted for the Clinton tax increase in 1993, and then the real problem for him became his vote in 1994 for gun control.
Wow.
And if you could pick out from a list of issues in 1994, it's really not that much different any time down here in this area, 2 issues that would put you at odds with the people in your district, your constituents. It would be raising taxes and passing gun control legislation. So more on those issues in particular, we were able to overcome a tremendous financial advantage that Mr. Darden had, as well as tremendous name ID that he had, and I was part of that huge sweep of Republicans in 1994 that switched the control of the House majority from the Democrat to the Republican for the first time in 40 years.
That is tremendous. What did you make when you came to Washington with this majority? You had there were a lot of prominent other prominent politicians that were there you served with at the time. Of course, Speaker Gingrich became Speaker. You had Dick Armey, who became Majority Leader. You had John Kasich, the former governor of Ohio. He was in Congress. How was that, coming in here? And the big issue that the Republicans ran on, their mantra, was this contract with America, which was Speaker Gingrich's idea. What did you make of the contract, and what was it like coming in there as a freshman?
Of course, it was historically, if not unique, pretty much unique. The Democrats had controlled all of the committees of the House, all of the levers of power for 4 decades. So the Republicans were faced, those who were incumbents in the 104th Congress, which began in January of 1995, were pretty much in the dark about how to run things. Nobody up there, with very, very few exceptions, had ever been in the majority, if any of them. So a lot of it was very much a learning experience. But as a freshman, it was a tremendously exciting time to be there, to be part of the first Republican majority in the House in 40 years. The contract with America, which many of the Democrats in the 1994 election made fun of, was really a genius move to set before the voters a very clear, very concise, very simple agenda, which said, in basically a sentence, if you, the voters, provide us the majority in the House of Representatives, we will do these 2 things. We will bring these 10 issues before the House for a vote within the first 100 days. It didn't overpromise. It didn't say we will pass them, because, of course, that was out of our control. But what was in the control of the new Republican majority was to bring these issues before the American people to the floor of the House for a vote. And they were all important issues. They weren't some of the hot-button issues like abortion, but they were very sound issues: a balanced budget amendment, a term limit amendment, passing regulations that made members of the House subject to the same restrictions that other citizens were subject to. We did that. We passed those 10 or brought those 10 measures to the floor of the House as promised within the first 100 days, and I think that really told the American people, for the first time in perhaps many years, that, hey, we have a group of folks here that actually followed through on what they promised they would do. Yeah. That was very important.
No doubt that is important. So you come in there. You were put on the Judiciary Committee due to your background as a lawyer, as U.S. attorney. What were the big issues that you wanted to tackle when you arrived in Congress? What really was something like young Congressman Barr said, I want to focus on this. I want to take care of this for the people of the 7th District.
Protecting the Second Amendment was very much at the top of my list, as it was at the top of the list for those who had voted for me, the people of the voters of the 7th District of Georgia. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, even before we got started with the work of the 104th Congress in January of 1995, I approached Speaker Gingrich, and I asked him if he would set up a Second Amendment task force that would be the focal point for those issues that we wanted to bring forward and hopefully pass relating to protecting the Second Amendment, such as undoing the Clinton gun ban from 1994. Mm-hmm. Speaker Gingrich agreed and appointed me as head of the Second Amendment Task Force, and that was the vehicle that we used to bring people together who supported the Second Amendment. Other issues that were very important to me were issues relating to privacy and government power. Surveillance power of the government was very, very important. And even though the powers, the technology the government has to surveil and invade people's privacy were not as pronounced and extensive as they are nowadays, mm-hmm. we saw that coming.
Really?
And that became a very, very important set of issues, privacy issues and government surveillance issues. And the Judiciary Committee, of course, with its jurisdiction over those kind of issues, was the real focal point mm-hmm. for those kind of things. Then probably another major issue at the time was to try and hold the federal government accountable for the horrible, I don't know any other way to put it, massacre of civilian citizens of Waco that had taken place just a couple of years before. Mm-hmm. And one of the first sets of hearings that we held in the spring of 1995 were on the Waco disaster in Waco, Texas, with ATF.
Yes, the Branch Davidian cult was in an armed standoff, and it led to like you said, a massacre where innocent people were killed, even some children were killed due to the government action. So you bring up these issues right here. Let's take those for a second, because some of those issues are still going on today. You said on the surveillance issue you saw that coming back then, but let's start with gun control. Buddy Darden supported the Clinton Gun Control Act in '94. Then you defeated him based on that, and then you were on the task force on the protecting the Second Amendment. With everything that's gone on with the Parkland shooting and now this March for Our Lives issue with David Hogg and Emma Gonzalez that suffered during that time, why are so many people just so eager to just attack the firearm, which is just what one evil person decided to use to commit this tragedy? Why do they want to go after the firearms rather than just say, hey, this was a bad person, there was failure with law enforcement, failure with the school to protect the students? Why go after the guns? Where does this come from?
It comes from basic human nature to take the easiest path to something. It's far easier to attack an inanimate object as the excuse for society's failure to properly educate people and to set up systems whereby children are protected. There are reasonable measures that law enforcement can use. It's far easier just to say, well, rather than address the cultural issues that have given rise to so many people who are of a mind to commit these horrible acts, mm-hmm. Let's just make it more difficult for everybody to obtain a firearm.
Right.
And that's easier, although ultimately it's dangerous because, one, it doesn't solve the problems, and secondly, it gives people the false sense that they are solving a problem, and thirdly, it is a vehicle or a way by which government can erode fundamental rights that we have, not only as citizens of the United States, but as children of God, to protect ourselves.
Right. And there's one big push that's going on right now is the law that's being pushed that will allow people who have been cleared, that have a license to carry a firearm within their own state, to go across the state line and not be prosecuted. Many people call it constitutional carry. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think that will pass? And should it already have been passed?
Yes and no. Yes, it should have already been passed. It shouldn't even need a vote. I mean, for heaven's sake, you have a Second Amendment to the Constitution which guarantees an individual right to keep and bear arms.
Yep.
You have the 14th Amendment, which protects the basic privileges or immunities of citizenship that predated the Constitution itself, which means that it incorporates, it recognizes that there is an inherent fundamental pre-government right to have a firearm to protect oneself. So simply given the Second Amendment and the 14th Amendment together, it should be a no-brainer. Well,
yeah.
People in America, regardless of what state you live in, have a fundamental right to keep and bear arms.
Right.
Yet, for years now, the Supreme Court has refused to take up that issue, and Congress has failed to pass legislation. Even though it's unnecessary to do it, we need to do it. I don't see certainly the current makeup of the House of Representatives taking it up.
No way.
The real battle with the current makeup of the House of Representatives is to prevent further erosion of our Second Amendment rights.
Right.
So I don't see us winning that battle legislatively, at least in this current biennium. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court may take up some of these issues that it really has refused to take up for the last 10 years. I mean, since the Heller decision in 2008
Absolutely.
and the McDonald decision 2 years later, mm-hmm. the Supreme Court has finally told us that what is obvious all along is indeed obvious.
They're just reaffirming.
The Second Amendment protects a right to keep and bear arms. But unfortunately, beyond that, the Supreme Court has not ruled. And even though Justice Scalia and even more recently Clarence Thomas, who is probably the best student and advocate of the Constitution on the Supreme Court, has said the Supreme Court needs to take up these issues. They need to further define and further protect the Second Amendment. They go out of their way to do it for the First Amendment, but the Second Amendment appears to be sort of the unloved stepchild, or whatever the analogy is. But hopefully we'll at least get some relief there, but it's not going to come from the Congress right now.
All right, obviously. But anyway, let's move on since we are on limited time. One thing that a lot of people know you for nationally was your role in the impeachment of President Clinton. Ever since President Clinton got elected, there was always a scandal going on. It seemed every week when you opened the newspaper, turned on your TV, there was something. There was Travelgate, there was Whitewater, there was the death of his attorney, Vince Foster. Then there was, of course, Paula Jones and all these other women. And then then there was the China Gate, where you got involved, which is a campaign finance issue. But ultimately, President Clinton was brought to testify. He went before the independent counsel, which was headed by former Solicitor General Ken Starr, who was also a federal judge. When Clinton went before, we talked about this with Congressman Swindall. When you go in front of a grand jury and you're questioned, you have three options. You have, tell the truth, lie, take the Fifth Amendment. Did you watch Clinton's testimony?
I did. As a matter of fact, if I remember correctly, I was actually doing an interview with an Atlanta radio station at the time, and so we watched it and provided sort of live commentary.
Well, I want to try to do that again. We have a clip of that testimony. I want to play it for you here. It's going to come up.
If Monica Lewinsky says that while you were in the Oval Office area you touched her breast, would she be lying?
Let me say something about all this.
All I really need for you, Mr. President,
I know,
is to say I won't answer under the previous grounds or to answer the question. You see, because we only have 4 hours and your answers are extremely lengthy.
But go ahead and ask your questions.
The question is, if Monica Lewinsky says that while you were in the Oval Office area you touched her breast, would she be lying?
That is not my recollection. My recollection is that I did not have sexual relations with Ms. Lewinsky, and I'm staying on my former statement about that.
If she
my statement is that I did not have sexual relations as defined by that.
If she says that you kissed her breast, would she be lying?
I'm going to revert to my former statement.
Okay. If Monica Lewinsky says that while you were in the Oval Office area you touched her genitalia, would she be lying? That calls for a yes, no, or reverting to your former statement.
I will revert to my statement on that.
If Monica Lewinsky says that you used a cigar as a sexual aid with her in the Oval Office area, would you be lying? Yes, no, or won't answer?
I will revert to my former statement.
If Monica Lewinsky says that you had phone sex with her would she be lying?
Well, that is, at least in general terms, I think is covered by my statement. I addressed that in my statement, and that I don't believe is.
Let me define phone sex for purposes of my question. Phone sex occurs when a party to a phone conversation masturbates while the other party is talking in a sexually explicit manner. And the question is, if Monica Lewinsky says that you had phone sex with her, would she be lying?
I think that is covered by my statement.
Wow, that is pretty graphic. I apologize for that, having to offend anybody. When you were watching that happen live, and especially the moment there when he's asked about the cigar, and his eyes just were kind of like, you could tell he was nervous, like they knew something. What was going through your mind when you saw that?
It was, I mean, it's not pleasant to watch. It wasn't pleasant to watch it at the time, and it's not pleasant now to watch it. The man, whether we like him or not, was the President of the United States.
Absolutely.
And to be subject to that is very discomforting for everybody, as it should be. But it was a situation of his own making.
That's right.
President Clinton put himself in that situation of having to be terribly embarrassed and made uncomfortable because of one, actions that he took voluntarily with Monica Lewinsky and other women while he was president in the White House during the time that he was engaged in executive actions as the president.
Right.
And he lied about it.
Mm-hmm. That leads me to a point, and you've written a book about this, and the meaning, and the book is "The Meaning of Is: The Squandered Impeachment and Wasted Legacy of William Jefferson Clinton." And I've marked some of the things you've said in here. And a lot of people were angry, of course, at Congress for, one, impeaching the president, mad at the independent counsel because, obviously, this is their guy. They didn't want this. And here's one thing you wrote. You said, like so much of what Clinton and his defenders said, this may not be technically untrue. The Constitution does not expressly prescribe a president's personal conduct, nor should it. That does not mean, however, that a president gets or was even entitled to receive a free pass for behaving like a depraved Caligula in the Oval Office. That's pretty straightforward. It's not in the Constitution, but again, it doesn't make it okay for what the president did.
No, I mean a lot of these issues, Eric, as you know, as a student of the Constitution, it requires tackling these kind of issues requires a basic understanding of our government and our constitutional republic.
Right.
The Constitution, unlike, for example, the European Union Constitution, which is over 500 pages long, if I recall, is a document that prescribes the basic manner in which our government is structured and operates. It doesn't say everything that a president or the Congress can or can't do. It simply lays out the basic responsibilities. All legislative power resides in the Congress. All executive power resides in a president. And then places restrictions on those responsibilities. Underlying it, as we see from a reading, for example, of some of the Federalist Papers, is the notion that a president and other civil officers of the United States are held and are to be held accountable. They have to obey the laws. And if a president engages in what are referred to in the Constitution as high crimes and misdemeanors, which meant at the time and currently violations of the public trust, a president or other civil officer engaging in actions while president, as president, that are serious and undercut that fundamental structure and responsibility of government, then the president is held accountable by impeachment. And that's what we did in the House in December of 1998. The president was impeached for perjury and obstruction of justice.
Right, and that was actually in Chapter 7 in the same book. this is what you wrote about the Senate. You said the House cloakroom is a crowded, almost threadbare antechamber where you spend time only if you have no other alternative between votes. In the Senate, the sitting room adjacent to the chamber is filled with some of the most comfortable lazy boys I have ever plopped in. In the House, we were used to getting our own water, but the senators each had a personal glass that was studiously refilled on a regular basis by a bevy of blue-blazered pages. So the life of a congressman seems to be a little more down to earth than that of a senator, and it seems obviously that was the case when, even though the Republicans were in the majority in the Senate at the time of the impeachment trial, President Clinton was ultimately acquitted. But since we're I want to move on here to some more modern day, since we are running low on time. We've had some people announce that they're running for president on the Democratic side to oppose President Trump. I've got some photographs up here, and I'd like to get your independent assessment of each one. I'm going to start with the first person to announce, and that was Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. What do you think of her?
Not a great deal. She really brings, in terms of substance and ability, I think very, very little to the equation of being a serious candidate for president. And you know, the whole controversy over her claiming Native American heritage continues to haunt her, as it should. I mean, it was a ridiculous, untrue statement to have made in the first place. But beyond that, her resume is extremely thin. So I certainly, even though she is well known, she has very high name ID, I personally don't consider her a serious candidate.
What about Kamala Harris?
She has some substance. She served as the Attorney General for the state of California, sits on the Judiciary Committee, and although I disagree with her on pretty much most issues, probably not everything, but she's extremely liberal. But at least she has a resume and has shown herself competent to serve in that capacity. So I consider her a more serious candidate.
Tulsi Gabbard, the Congresswoman from Hawaii.
I think essentially a non-entity.
Non-entity. Wow, that's pretty straightforward. Senator Gillibrand.
Sort of in between Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris, perhaps. She does have some background that shows that she does have competencies in some core areas, and she comes from a very populous state, New York, which has a lot of electoral votes, which is important, unlike Hawaii, which has the minimum. So I think she should be taken seriously. Again, she's extremely liberal, so I certainly could not vote for her, but she has, as they might say, at least some gravitas.
Sure. Joe Biden.
I would not write Joe Biden out, despite the fact that he's old and has been around for a long time. He knows how to play the media extremely well. I recall back when I was still working for the agency back in the 70s, sitting as a junior legislative aide, I was watching a hearing of a committee on which Senator Biden sat, and I was watching him, and he kept changing from this side to the other side. He kept moving back and forth, and finally I realized it was because he was watching the TV cameras that were there, that were recording it, and which one was operating. So he always wanted to be in the line of sight for the cameras. And he's very media savvy, and although I don't see him taking the nomination, primarily because he just has been around a long time.
He's run twice before and lost.
But he certainly will figure in the equation.
Michael Bloomberg.
I don't see Michael Bloomberg running. He brings extreme financial resources to it.
Sure.
Howard Schultz does, and Howard Schultz has indicated now that he's thinking of running as an independent, which would be very, very interesting, because one of the issues apparently that he will be running on is the national debt. which used to be an issue that was important to Republicans.
That's what Ross Perot ran on.
Doesn't seem to be nowadays. So I don't see Bloomberg running. I really don't think he will. But Howard Schultz might very well run as an independent.
That'd be interesting to see. Bernie Sanders.
I think he had his day last time. Did better than a lot of people, thought he would. But I think his time is past. He still does appeal to a core ultra-liberal element for free everything.
Yeah.
And that will get him a certain number of votes. But in a crowded field, as there almost certainly is going to be on the Democratic side, I really don't see him rising to one of the top candidates.
I agree with your assessment there very much. Since we're talking about free stuff, the Democrats' new favorite face is this Congresswoman from New York who's the same age as myself, and that's Ocasio-Cortez. She's made a lot of odd statements people will qualify as gaffes. I have one queued up here. I want to get your response to this because this really bothered me when I heard it.
Maybe this idea of idealizing this outcome of maybe one day you too can be a billionaire and own more than millions of families combined is not an aspirational or good thing.
Do we live in a moral world that allows for billionaires? Is that a moral outcome in and of itself?
It's not. Well, first of all, when we talk about this conversation on marginal tax rates, it's an economic question, but it's also a moral question. It is the policy translation of a proposed answer to what kind of society do we want to live in. Are we comfortable with a society where someone can have a personal helipad while this city is experiencing the highest rates of people experiencing homelessness since the Great Depression? Should those two things coexist at the same time? And I think a 70% marginal tax rate, especially when we're starting to talk about your 10 millionth dollar, your 10 millionth and $1, all of those.
Yes, to be clear, it's not a family earning $30,000 being
right,
taxed 70%.
Exactly.
Right.
It's saying, where do we draw the line in excess? And at what point do we return to this question that King asked, that Gandhi asked, that is our material technology outpacing our moral technology? Is our material sophistication outpacing our human sophistication? And when we allow things to just run by default, this is where we get to. We get to where 6 people in the United States have more wealth than half the country, if not more. And so I think that when we talk about marginal tax rates, 70%, we have to say at some point we need to start incentivizing investment in actual people, in working people, and the majority of people. And that maybe just...
Wow. Every time I hear that woman, I just, my muscles just lock. I get so irritated. She says the system, a free system that allows for people to gain wealth in the billions of dollars, is immoral. And people believe that. Why is America, changed from make yourself where you can become rich to now that we're going to give you everything, free everything, come to the government? And the second part of this question is, this is a congresswoman. She makes $174,000 a year. How is that moral?
According to her definition, it's completely immoral, certainly. She's spouting absolute nonsense. It's just gobbledygook. And it would be very easy to dismiss it as such.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and I think this gets to what you're asking about, she is speaking to an audience and speaking in an environment in which for essentially 3 generations now, people have grown up turning to government and viewing government as the default for everything they want or to fix everything they don't like. So in that environment where you cannot build a home without endless approvals, regulations to deal with from the government, the government is telling you how much water has to be in a toilet tank. The list goes on and on, where even our fundamental rights for a defendant or person accused of crime, if they happen to be in a college or high school that receives $1 of federal funds, they basically have given up their right to confront witnesses, be apprised of charges against them, have due process, and so forth. So in that sort of environment, where government is seen as both the force to correct everything that's wrong and to dictate everything that should be right, what Ms. Ocasio-Cortez is saying, even though to a knowledgeable observer, is utter nonsense. I mean, nothing that she says fits together, even syntactically, much less based on the underlying ideas. It has a great deal of surface appeal, and unfortunately cannot be discounted.
It cannot be discounted, obviously, but this woman is getting so much attention. She seems to be like Joe Biden, and she loves to be on camera. I haven't seen her at a committee hearing yet, but I'm sure we'll see that eventually. Where she's on the Financial Services Committee, headed by Maxine Waters, of all people. Yeah, God help us all there. But she's on Letterman. She's getting attention for everything. She's turning down sound debate from anybody. If you dare challenge her, she says, "I don't respond to cat calls." She plays the victim card very, very well. But why do Americans, particularly young people, run to people like her and say, "Hey, just the government will handle all this"? Why is it government is the good side and private business is bad?
Because they've been told this and they've been shown this.
But they all
3 generations now.
But they all have an iPhone. They all have a MacBook. They all drive cars and live in.
Well, a lot of them now don't even drive cars. I know young people who are 16, 17, 18 years old that don't even get a driver's license because they don't need to or want to drive. They can pay somebody else to drive them, or they can ride a little scooter or whatnot. But the real point is, and this is a very serious question that you put your finger on, is we now have an environment in which if somebody tells you government should pay for your college education, after all, you have a right to college education, people...
Where does it say that in the Constitution?
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds great. Well, they see it if ever pose that question. Well, Congress does stuff in the general welfare. So it's in my welfare, it's in the welfare of our country to have everybody go to college. So, of course, government should pay for that. They can use taxes to pay for things in the general welfare. And the general welfare means everybody has a right, of course, to health care. They have a right to education. They have a right to a nice house. They have a right to a nice job. And that's the environment.
But all those rights are paid for by other people.
Well, those immoral billionaires, of course. It's a very circular argument. But it is extremely dangerous when we reach the point where you have serious contenders for the presidency of the United States and 20-something-ish members of Congress, now the face of our government.
It is.
It's dangerous and it's frightening, Eric.
It is. It is dangerous. It is frightening, and it burns me to my core when I see people wanting this sort of thing, and people criticize me for saying, well, your college education is paid for by the government because I'm on the GI Bill as a veteran. And I said, yeah, but the GI Bill is not given to me. I didn't have a right to the GI Bill. I had to earn that. I had to go give part of my service and service to my country, and this is an outcome I get. And it was not easy to earn either.
Correct.
But again, and the GI Bill is, I think, and a lot of people, I think bipartisan would say that's probably one of the best government programs ever created. But it's only for less than 1% of the population.
Well,
so it can work.
Again, it's a contractual relationship.
Exactly.
You went into the military, served honorably in the military.
I did.
In return for which, because of your sacrifices in the military, taking yourself out of the income earning population for a while, serving where the country needs you and where the service needs you. In return for that, the government has promised you contractually that you will be able to get funds to attend college. But what Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez are talking about has nothing to do with that. It's simply people have an inherent right to go to college, therefore taxpayers ought to pay for it. Of course, the one right that is expressly guaranteed in the Constitution, the right to keep and bear arms to them, is very different.
Right. Yeah.
But the contradictions just seem to go over their head.
Government should pay for my firearms. I shouldn't have to buy them. They should just, because I have a right to, they should just give me whatever I want.
Yeah, that's an interesting read on it.
Yeah.
That's what they should be saying.
That would sound totally crazy even to a person like me, because again, the government doesn't have any money. All the money has is money that comes from us. But unfortunately, we are out of time. I know you have got to run, but I thoroughly thank you for coming on to the show today. I've enjoyed it immensely. I hope you'll come back. We've got a lot more to talk about. And for any of you all who want to meet Congressman Barr, if you happen to be in the Atlanta, Georgia area, he will be at the Cobb County GOP headquarters next Saturday, and it will be the 20th anniversary of the Clinton impeachment. Congressman, you'll be talking about your role there. And is the event free? Does it cost anything?
It is. I think they may have a charge for the breakfast if you want to take advantage of the breakfast, but it should be a good meeting. And I appreciate you mentioning that.
You're very welcome. I'll be there myself. So if you want to come over and talk to me about anything, or just come listen to the congressman here, come on out. I'll post a link in the description of this video. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. This has been the Free Speech Zone. I'm your host, Eric. See you next time. Open to it. Let's get to it.